Clara Hensley and Sophie Lang were the kind of friends everyone admired, inseparable, loyal, and devoted. But behind Sophie's warm smile hid a darkness so deep that no one in the quiet town of Wrenton could have imagined it. When Clara vanished without a trace, the search for her uncovered more than a tragedy. It revealed a terrifying truth. The monster the town feared wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was one of their own. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Wrenton was the kind of English town people described as peaceful, almost untouched by time. Rows of old stone cottages lined the main road. A single post office still stood beside the bakery, and the church bell rang every Sunday morning. Everyone knew each other's business, but it was never malicious, just the way small towns worked. Life in Wrenton followed a familiar rhythm, until the day it didn't. The shift began quietly, almost unnoticeably, with the absence of one person, Clara Hensley. Clara was a name that brought warmth to those who knew her. At 27, she had built a life that many admired. She worked as an art teacher at Wrenton Primary, spending her days helping children paint, sculpt, and see the world through color. Her flat above the florist shop was always filled with the smell of fresh lilies and the faint sound of music. She lived alone but was rarely lonely, always surrounded by friends, her students, and her endless sketches of the town's streets and hills. To everyone, Clara was reliable, gentle, and full of light. That's why it didn't make sense when she didn't show up for school one Monday morning. The head teacher called her several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. By lunchtime, messages began spreading through the staff room. Had anyone seen her? Some assumed she'd caught the flu, others thought she might have taken a short trip. But when another day passed, and there was still no sign of her, the unease began to spread. Her friend and colleague reported it to the police late Tuesday evening. Officers visited her flat, expecting to find her at home, unwell or resting. Instead, they found the door locked from the outside. Inside, everything was neat and untouched. No sign of a struggle, no broken glass, nothing missing. Her car was parked where it always was, and her handbag sat neatly on the table. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The police began asking questions, speaking with neighbors who recalled seeing her on Sunday afternoon, carrying groceries and humming as she walked upstairs. No one saw her after that. Her phone was last active that same evening, sending one final message that read simply, "I'll talk to you tomorrow." That tomorrow never came. The next few days turned Wrenton upside down. Volunteers gathered at the town hall, printing missing person posters and mapping out search areas. The fields and woodlands surrounding the town were combed by locals holding torches and calling her name into the dark. Each passing day brought a deeper sense of dread. The idea that something sinister could happen in Wrenton felt impossible, almost insulting. Bad things happened elsewhere, not here. By Friday, the quiet town was filled with news vans, their bright lights cutting through the November fog. Reporters asked the same question the townspeople whispered among themselves. How could someone disappear without a trace in a place where everyone knew everyone? The answer, though still hidden, was already there, lurking among them, wearing a familiar face, pretending to care. The killer was not a stranger passing through, but someone who smiled, comforted, and searched right alongside them. The horror of what was to come had already begun. No one yet realized that Wrenton's peace had been shattered not by an outsider, but by one of their own. When Clara's disappearance hit the news, Sophie Lang became one of the first people to step forward. She was the picture of concern, teary-eyed, exhausted, and desperate to help. Sophie had been Clara's closest friend since their university days in Brighton. They had shared a flat, exchanged secrets, and stayed in touch even after Clara moved to Wrenton. When Sophie heard that Clara was missing, she immediately took time off from her marketing job in London and drove down to help the search. To everyone in the town, her dedication was both touching and inspiring. She spoke to the local press, pleaded for anyone with information to come forward, and organized search teams that combed through fields and woodland. Her voice trembled when she described Clara as the kindest soul she had ever known. People in Wrenton quickly came to see Sophie as the emotional center of the search. She brought energy to every effort, creating online pages to raise awareness and printing hundreds of posters with Clara's photo. She even convinced a local cafe to keep its doors open late so volunteers could gather there after long days of searching. She hugged people, thanked them, and spoke about hope. In her presence, others found comfort. It seemed as if Sophie had made it her mission to find Clara, dead or alive. But beneath her calm, determined demeanor, there was something slightly off, something no one could quite name. She was always the first to arrive and the last to leave, always eager to speak with police officers, always standing near the cameras. When one reporter asked how she was coping, her answer seemed too rehearsed, her expression too carefully composed. Some people thought it was just her way of staying strong, but a few quietly wondered if there was something else behind those tired eyes. The police appreciated Sophie's cooperation. She gave them access to her phone, her messages with Clara, and her version of events from the days before the disappearance. She said she hadn't seen Clara in person for nearly a week, but had spoken to her on the phone on Saturday night. According to Sophie, Clara had sounded cheerful and mentioned plans to visit an art exhibition in London soon. It all seemed ordinary. Too ordinary. Detectives began to notice that Sophie inserted herself into nearly every part of the investigation. She offered theories, pointed out possible suspects, and even tried to convince officers to search specific areas, claiming Clara had once talked about painting there. Her involvement was helpful at first, but as days passed, some officers grew uneasy. It wasn't normal for a friend to act like an investigator or to take such control over the narrative. In the cafe where the volunteers gathered, Sophie often sat alone after everyone had left, staring at the wall of posters covered with Clara's smiling face. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes tracing every photo as if trying to solve a puzzle only she could understand. She once whispered to another volunteer that she couldn't stop dreaming about Clara calling her name from the woods. When locals saw her wandering near the quarry one night, they assumed she was just desperate to help, unable to rest until Clara was found. No one imagined that Sophie knew far more than she let on. No one realized that the woman who cried the loudest was also hiding the darkest truth of all, the truth that would soon turn the entire town against her. 5 days after Clara's disappearance, the town's growing anxiety turned into heartbreak. A jogger, taking his usual early morning route near the old quarry, stumbled upon something strange. A patch of freshly turned earth behind a cluster of trees. At first he thought it was just an animal's burrow, but when he noticed the corner of a fabric sleeve poking through the soil, panic gripped him. Within an hour the police had cordoned off the area, and the quiet quarry became the center of a full-scale crime scene. Beneath the shallow layer of dirt lay the body of Clara Hensley. Her face was pale, her hair tangled with mud, and her once gentle hands showed marks of a violent struggle. The discovery sent shockwaves through Wrenton. The police described the scene as chaotic but deliberate. Whoever buried Clara had done it quickly, yet there were clear signs they'd tried to cover their tracks. Nearby, officers found broken branches, a discarded shovel, and faint tire marks leading back toward the road. Forensic specialists combed every inch, collecting soil samples and fibers, but the most striking clue was something small and personal, a silver ring half buried near Clara's hand. It was engraved with a single letter. At first it seemed meaningless, just another piece of jewelry lost in the dirt. But as investigators later realized, it would become the thread that unraveled the entire case. The news spread across the country by evening. Reporters flooded into Wrenton, their cameras pointed at the quarry as police carried out evidence bags under the gray November sky. Locals gathered behind the barriers, some crying, others silent in disbelief. The kind-hearted art teacher they had searched for so desperately was gone, taken by someone cruel and deliberate. In the middle of it all stood Sophie Lang, visibly shaken but still composed. She was seen hugging Clara's mother, comforting her, and giving statements to the press. Her words sounded heartfelt, full of sorrow and rage. "Who could do something like this?" she said to one reporter. "She didn't deserve it." Her performance, as everyone saw it then, was flawless. Behind the scenes, detectives worked tirelessly to piece together Clara's final hours. They examined CCTV footage from nearby petrol stations and combed through her phone records. Late that night, an officer noticed something peculiar. Sophie Lang's number appeared repeatedly in Clara's call history in the days before she died, including one call made just hours before she disappeared. It was nothing conclusive, but it raised a quiet suspicion. When police asked Sophie about it, she explained that they were close friends and often talked late at night. Her voice was steady, her eyes dry. What no one realized yet was how deeply Sophie had woven herself into the tragedy. As the investigation continued, small inconsistencies began to surface, tiny cracks in her story, fleeting moments where her concern seemed rehearsed rather than real. But for now, the police treated her as just another grieving friend. The town mourned Clara's loss with candles and flowers laid outside the school where she had taught. Yet among the crowd that evening, standing in the glow of the flickering lights, was Clara's killer, watching, silent and undetected. Sophie Lang had done the unthinkable, and she had done it well enough to stand right among them, blending perfectly into the grief she had created. In the days following the discovery of Clara's body, investigators began to look more closely at her personal life. They went through her phone, her emails, and her bank records, searching for any clue that might lead them to the killer. At first, the detectives thought it might have been a stranger, a robbery gone wrong, a random attack in the woods. But as they dug deeper, that theory began to crumble. Nothing had been stolen from Clara. Her jewelry, her wallet, even her car keys had been left behind. The violence of the crime suggested something far more personal. Someone who knew her. Someone who had hated her enough to destroy her. It was through Clara's phone that they found the first crack in the story. Dozens of messages between her and Sophie Lang revealed a very different friendship from the one the world had seen. The early messages were warm and affectionate, full of plans, encouragement, and shared jokes, but the tone changed over the months leading up to her death. Clara had begun confronting Sophie about money that had gone missing. Transfers from Clara's account matched deposits made to Sophie's within hours of each other. When police questioned Sophie, she brushed it off as a misunderstanding. Clara had lent her money, she said. But when detectives compared their messages, the truth was far less innocent. Clara had accused Sophie of stealing. The investigators discovered that Clara had caught Sophie taking jewelry and artwork from her flat. Some of the missing pieces later appeared for sale online through an anonymous account traced to Sophie's computer. It became clear that Clara had planned to expose her friend. The final text message Clara ever sent to Sophie said, "We need to talk tomorrow. No more lies." That message was sent just hours before she vanished. Detectives began to notice other signs that pointed towards Sophie's involvement. When they looked through her social media, they found that she had deleted several old photos of her and Clara the day after the disappearance. Neighbors also reported seeing Sophie's car near the quarry the night Clara went missing, though she later denied ever going there. Her story began to twist in small, noticeable ways, each version slightly different from the last. Despite the mounting suspicions, Sophie continued to insert herself into the investigation. She offered help, asked constant questions about the evidence, and appeared eager to know what the police had found. Her behavior unsettled the lead detective, who quietly began to monitor her movements. While Sophie presented herself as a heartbroken friend, investigators started seeing something colder, a person meticulously managing how others perceived her. The image of Sophie Lang as the grieving best friend began to fracture. To the public, she was still the loyal companion who had lost someone dear. But to the police, she was quickly becoming the main suspect in a case that was no longer about disappearance, but betrayal. Behind her soft-spoken voice and trembling hands was a darkness no one had imagined. It wasn't just jealousy that had driven her. It was the fear of losing control, of being exposed. In her mind, Clara's death wasn't a mistake. It was a desperate attempt to silence the only person who knew who Sophie truly was. The cafe alibi had been Sophie Lang's strongest defense, the single detail she clung to when whispers began to circle around her. According to her story, she had spent the evening of Clara's disappearance sitting alone at the Wrenton Corner Cafe, finishing some freelance design work. She said she left around 11 p.m., went straight home, and didn't hear from Clara again. The cafe staff confirmed seeing her there, and for a short while, the police accepted her statement as fact. But one detective, Inspector Graham, couldn't shake a feeling that something about her alibi didn't sit right. He decided to take another look at the cafe's security footage, and what he found changed everything. At first glance, the footage seemed to support Sophie's claim. There she was, sitting at a corner table, laptop open, a cup of coffee beside her. The timestamp clearly read 9:42 p.m., and the footage showed her staying until nearly 11. But when Graham paused the video, he noticed something strange. In the reflection of the cafe's front window, the sky outside was bright. It wasn't nighttime, it was daylight. He rewound and replayed the clip several times before realizing what had happened. The timestamp had been altered. The footage had been edited to make it appear as though Sophie had been there that night. The discovery sent a shockwave through the investigation team. They dug deeper, obtaining the cafe's system logs and access history. It didn't take long to find that the security system had been remotely accessed just 2 days after Clara's death. The IP address used for that access was traced back to Sophie Lang's home internet. When confronted with this evidence, Sophie insisted she had no idea how that could be possible. She said she might have logged in to check the footage herself out of curiosity, but investigators knew better. They learned that Sophie had a background in digital design and media editing. She had the skills and the motive to manipulate the video. Once her alibi fell apart, everything else began to unravel. Detectives revisited her previous statements and found inconsistencies in her timeline. She had claimed to arrive at the cafe just before 9, but her car was spotted on a traffic camera heading toward the quarry road at 8:47. She said she left the cafe around 11, yet no witnesses saw her leave. The entire evening she described seemed to exist only in her mind and the doctored footage she created. The cafe manager, when re-interviewed, admitted he had only glanced at the footage once, trusting what he saw. Now, with the truth exposed, even he felt betrayed. The town began to murmur. The same people who once praised Sophie's devotion started questioning her motives. Why would someone go to such lengths to alter evidence unless they had something terrible to hide? Detectives grew convinced that Sophie had not only murdered Clara, but had spent the following days carefully constructing her innocence. The cafe footage was her masterpiece, a digital mask to hide the night she buried her friend. But the one detail she overlooked, the reflection of daylight in the window, was enough to shatter her entire illusion. The mask she had worn so perfectly began to crumble, and beneath it the face of a killer was finally beginning to show. When investigators searched Sophie Lang's flat, they expected to find small clues, perhaps receipts, clothing fibers or traces of soil that could link her to the quarry. What they discovered instead was something far darker, something that revealed the true depth of her obsession with Clara Hensley. The flat, at first glance, was spotless. Everything was arranged neatly, every item perfectly placed, but a locked drawer in her bedroom caught the attention of the officers. Inside, wrapped in a velvet pouch, was a small USB drive. It seemed ordinary, but when detectives examined it back at the station, they uncovered a disturbing digital archive that exposed Sophie's hidden world. The drive contained hundreds of files, photos, videos, and documents, all revolving around Clara. There were pictures of her at school events, at art fairs, and walking through Wrenton streets, taken from a distance as if someone had been following her. Some images were recent, while others dated back years, suggesting that Sophie had been documenting Clara's life long before anyone suspected trouble between them. It became clear that this wasn't the friendship Sophie had described to the world. It was an obsession carefully disguised as affection. Among the folders were notes written in Sophie's own words. They were fragments of thoughts, angry paragraphs, and emotional rants. In one file she wrote about how Clara took everything from her: the attention, the admiration, the life she wanted. In another, she described feeling invisible beside her, as if Clara's kindness overshadowed her existence. The tone of these entries shifted from sadness to resentment, and finally to something chillingly detached. It was as though Sophie had convinced herself that destroying Clara was the only way to regain control of her own life. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of video diaries Sophie had recorded over several months. In them, she spoke directly to the camera, her voice calm and eerily steady. She talked about how Clara had betrayed her, how she felt humiliated by being exposed as a thief. She described Clara's confrontation in detail, how she had looked at her with disappointment rather than anger, and how that look had filled her with unbearable rage. The last video, recorded just 2 days before Clara's disappearance, ended with Sophie saying, "I know what I have to do. She doesn't get to ruin me." The USB drive was more than evidence. It was a window into Sophie's mind. It showed how she had transformed from a loyal friend into someone consumed by envy and fear. Investigators realized the murder wasn't spontaneous. It was planned, rehearsed in her thoughts for weeks. The thefts, the manipulation, even the way she tried to maintain control over Clara's life, all of it led to that final act of violence. When police confronted her with what they found, Sophie's composure began to fade. The confident, grieving friend who had organized searches and comforted others started to crack under the weight of her own secrets. She denied the files at first, then claimed they were part of a personal art project, an excuse that fell apart instantly. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. The woman who once stood as a symbol of hope in Wrenton was now exposed as the architect of its darkest tragedy. The USB had spoken for her, and its voice was undeniable. After the discovery of the USB drive, the investigation moved quickly. The evidence was no longer a collection of suspicions or theories. It was hard proof that Sophie Lang had been hiding something monstrous. Detectives arrested her at her flat early one morning, just as the town was waking up. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains as Sophie was led out in handcuffs, her expression eerily calm. There were no tears, no panic, no attempt to explain herself. She simply looked ahead, silent, as if she had been expecting it all along. At the station, Sophie sat across from the lead investigators in a small windowless room. The walls were bare, the air heavy. She spoke politely, even smiled at times, as though she were still performing for the public. When asked about the USB drive, she said she didn't remember creating those files. She claimed someone must have stolen her belongings and planted them to frame her. Her voice never trembled, her gaze never shifted. But the detectives had more than just the files. They had DNA evidence. Under Clara's fingernails, forensic teams had found traces of Sophie's skin cells, proof that Clara had fought back before she died. Combined with the ring found at the scene and the doctored cafe footage, the case against her was undeniable. As questioning continued, Sophie's calm began to waver. Her responses grew shorter, her confidence faded. She fidgeted with her hands, twisting her fingers as if trying to hold herself together. When confronted with the timeline of Clara's final hours, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the table. The detective leaned forward and placed a small speaker on the desk. "There's something else you need to hear," he said before pressing play. The room filled with faint, muffled sounds, a recording recovered from the same USB drive. It began with footsteps, then voices. Clara's voice was frightened but steady, asking Sophie to leave her alone. The audio cracked, followed by the sound of a struggle and a single scream that faded into silence. After that came Sophie's voice, low and cold, whispering words that chilled everyone in the room. "You'll never leave me again." The recording lasted less than a minute, but it said more than any confession ever could. When the sound stopped, Sophie didn't speak. She stared at the small device on the table, her breathing slow and uneven. The detectives waited, but she offered no defense. In that moment, the mask she had worn for so long completely dissolved. She was no longer the grieving friend or the community's hero. She was the killer who had built her own trap and then walked straight into it. Later, in court, the prosecution described Sophie as a woman driven by envy, who destroyed the one person she claimed to love most. The jury took less than 2 hours to find her guilty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led away, she didn't look at anyone, not even Clara's family. Her silence was final, her eyes empty. The woman who had fooled an entire town was now nothing more than a prisoner, locked away with the echoes of her own crime. Wrenton was never the same after the truth came out. The quiet, peaceful town that had once prided itself on safety and friendship became a place haunted by suspicion and loss. The people who had once gathered for Sunday markets and school events now spoke in hushed tones, glancing over their shoulders as if darkness might still be hiding among them. For many, it wasn't just the horror of Clara Hensley's death that lingered. It was the realization that the person responsible had been right beside them all along. Sophie Lang had walked their streets, smiled at their children, and stood shoulder to shoulder with them during the search for her own victim. The betrayal cut deeper than the crime itself. In the months following the trial, Clara's family struggled to rebuild their lives. Her mother moved away from Wrenton, unable to bear passing the places that reminded her of her daughter. The art classroom, the florist below her flat, the path leading toward the quarry. Her father, who rarely spoke to anyone, spent his days tending to a small garden behind their new home, growing lilies because they had been Clara's favorite. Every year on the anniversary of her death, he mailed a letter addressed to her old school, asking the teachers to place flowers by her classroom window. The children who had once adored her continued the tradition, leaving drawings, handmade cards, and painted stones beneath her plaque. The townspeople, too, carried the memory like a shadow. The cafe where Sophie had faked her alibi eventually closed down, unable to escape its connection to the case. The quarry, once a favorite walking spot for locals, became a place no one dared to visit. The old paths were overgrown, and the air there seemed heavier, as if the land itself remembered what had happened. Even years later, newcomers to Wrenton heard the story whispered to them, the tale of two friends whose bond had turned deadly. For the detectives who had worked on the case, it remained one of the most unsettling they had ever seen. They spoke of Sophie not as a monster in the obvious sense, but as a chilling reminder of how evil can exist behind ordinary smiles. She wasn't impulsive or visibly unstable. She had been organized, intelligent, and calculating. That was what made her so terrifying. She had fooled everyone, including herself, into believing she was good. In prison, Sophie Lang lived a quiet, withdrawn life. She never spoke about the murder, never gave interviews, and never expressed remorse. Some said she painted in her cell, filling sketchbooks with landscapes that looked eerily like Wrenton. Others said she spent most of her time staring out the narrow window, silent and detached. Her name became something people avoided saying aloud, as if keeping it unspoken might keep the evil from returning. Years later, Wrenton still bore the scar of what had happened. The story of Clara Hensley and Sophie Lang became part of local folklore, retold in cautionary whispers. Parents warned their children about jealousy, about trust, about the masks people wear. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the empty streets, some swore they could still hear faint echoes near the old school, a soft voice calling for a friend who would never answer again. It was a haunting reminder that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers lurking in the dark, but from the ones who walk beside us, smiling all the while.